Welcome to Mike Builds a Boat. For 11 episodes now, I've stood in front of this camera and promised a certain level of completion and rarely delivered. So all I'm going to say for this one is we've got great weather, I've got the stem ready to go, and we're going to get as far as we can. Thanks for joining me. Getting the stem brought to its final shape really serves two purposes. The first and most obvious one is to provide a nice, flat, fair landing surface for the planking as it wraps around the station molds and then terminates flush with the front of the stem. But before that can happen, getting the stem to shape reveals the intersection between the flat part of the stem down here and the beveled part, and that flat part is the landing surface where the shear clamps have to land, as well as the chine. So that it doesn't become too confusing, I'm going to send it to Studio Mike and let him explain a little terminology. Okay, so here's what we're going for. The dark brown piece that you see is the chine, and that's the framing member that takes care of the fastenings for where the bottom planking and the side planking intersect. The shear clamps in dark green right here really serve two functions. The first is that they define the shear line, or really the line that you see of the boat in profile. And the reason why the bowler has two of them is that the raised foredeck has its own shear. The other function is to tie the side planking into the side deck and also the foredeck, as well as provide a lot of longitudinal strength for the boat. While I've been waiting for a day as nice as this one to come along, when I knew that I could do the epoxy work up here that was necessary and have it cure in a reasonable amount of time, I took the liberty of taking the lower shear clamp and having it roughly positioned in place with the idea that, having done this before, I'd be perfectly fine forcing this end into contact with the stem and cutting that angle as the pieces got close, and all would be good to go. So, seeing it now, I think I'm going to call an audible and change direction and do some cutting on the front end here of the shear clamps so that they essentially wind up being laminations and will be able to give me the twist that I need and the curve that I need without terrifying me that I'm going to explode them as I try to bring the ends together. To test my idea, I took a piece of stock that I had a little bit left over that's the same size and material as the shear clamps themselves, and I just stood it up and ran it through the bandsaw, in this case making 3 cuts. And what I'm finding is that I can easily twist this, and also it bends really nicely. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 30-foot long pieces of lumber back over to the shop, prop them up, get them nicely supported, and set up a nice tight blocking arrangement at the bandsaw. And I think I'm going to make 2 cuts instead of 3. And I think those 2 cuts, just for the first station and a half, maybe to somewhere in this vicinity back here, is going to be enough to allow for the twist and the bend that's most extreme right up against the stem. The other thing that I'm focusing on getting done today while the temperature's up is getting the scarf joints glued together for the stock that's going to become the hull planking. As you saw many months ago, Jay and I got all the stock milled and got the scarf joints cut. And I'm just taking the planking bench here and laying, 3 or 4 rows deep and about 30 feet long, laying pieces end to end, kind of making them oriented the way that I want, and throwing some Gorilla Glue on, which really needs higher temperatures even more so than epoxy. And so I'm doing most of this stuff off camera, but about every hour and a half I've been stopping and doing another batch, and it looks like I'm going to get most of the strips done today, which is fantastic, because it might be a while before I get temperatures this nice again. The key for making this work well is to get these pieces lined up front to back where the scarves are going to be overlapping where I want. But before I clamp this, I take a clamp downstream and go ahead and get that locked in place. And what that allows me to do is put pressure right here on these two ramps and not have them spread apart. I'm only concerning myself really with making the top edge of this flush. The bottom edge is going to wind up being uneven because of how we went about ripping the strips. But all these are going to get fed through the planer and taken down to their final, I believe it's 11/16 inch thickness before they're offered up to the boat. So this is something that's turned out to be extremely handy, and something that I've used on my previous build was just taking small pieces of scrap plywood and cutting miscellaneous U-shapes in the end of it. Between that and these 6-inch Harbor Freight clamps, I can do a lot of two-person things with one person. So the goal here before I get this too locked into place fore and aft is to have just enough sticking forward that I can trim it off and get the angle cut. And by doing that, if I make a mistake, I will have probably 18 inches or so extended beyond the transom, and I can just take that slack up and try again. And I'm really glad I didn't waste any time making it more complicated than it needed to be. However, I might wind up eating my words. Alright, so this was a problem that I absolutely should have seen coming. By making the rip cuts end so close to the stem, I wound up creating a couple of hard spots instead of a fair curve once I put the chine pieces in place. So after some cussing and head scratching, I decided the solution was pretty simple. Take the chines back off of the boat and extend the rip cuts back further aft until they're in a position where there's not any natural bending stress on, somewhere around station 6. So it's back to the bandsaw, and no, Megan isn't that terrified of me when I'm around power tools. The logging helmet was just the most convenient hearing protection that she could find. It was at about this point that I realized that although I had fixed the hard spots by extending the rips, I had created myself a whole new set of problems, and the chines just weren't laying right, and it was time to turn off my brain, step away from the project, and call it a day. It's another great afternoon, not only because it's glorious weather, but because I think I found a solution on how to make these chines fit. Let's go. One thing I've definitely found helpful as an amateur boat builder is to define success as the process of exchanging a big problem for a smaller problem. And that's exactly what I wound up doing a couple weeks ago when I lengthened the rips on the chines to eliminate those two hard spots. So what I wound up with instead are these 3 thinner laminations for the chines, and although they'll definitely bend around the curve better, when I try to lay them in these pre-cut notches on the station molds, what I wound up seeing is a lot of buckling on the top edge as I try to adapt the twist and the curve, but most importantly, the edge setting, or the bending along the wider axis of the board. So here on the port side, I have the notches where they were originally shown on the drawings. Really, I just scaled off the plans, and that's got an accuracy of maybe a ½ an inch, 1 inch at the most. And although this is where they were drawn, I was finding that I was really having to fight the chine material to try to come anywhere near a fair curve. So here on the port side, I've left it as it is, but over on the starboard side, I think I figured out how to tackle this one. So what I wound up doing was taking a look at the prints and seeing if there was anything about the chine's location that was going to require that it be exactly in a specific place. And I wasn't seeing that. So what I've done is, as you can see right here, part of the original notch, I've moved this one up probably about 1.5 inches. And the way I found that here at station 3 was I just notched the different stations a little bit and started moving this up until I could feel the edge setting relax. And what I found as a side benefit of that is that the twist required at each station was a lot easier to put in, and now everything is pretty much roughly tacked in place. A few shims just to make sure the twist winds up being what it needs to be at each station. And most importantly, by putting my eye down it, I haven't created any bumps in anything anywhere. So anyway, the starboard side here looks like it's going to be pretty much ready to go once I get the intersection at the stem cut and to the proper angle and some board for some screws. Well, I could not be any happier at how the starboard side chine has turned out. It's laying so nicely across the station mold notches with just a little bit of shimming to put the right amount of twist in, and really moving those notch locations was surely the way to go. And I'm going to say it was 67% skill and then 2/3 luck. So anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this video, and I'm just going to spend a little time between now and when I film again getting the port side to match and getting the aft stuff tied in. That's just going to be a few screws and one little notch in the transom, and we'll pick it up there with some epoxying. Thanks for joining me.